an original.
From Story Studio Network.
I want you to think about this. Canadian forestry has a role to play in saving the planet.
Absolutely. The answer is yes.
Welcome to this Story Studio Network podcast series. I'm Dave Trafford. In this series, Aaron Trafford and I will explore a number of ideas that hinge on the notion of Canadian forestry helping to save the world.
There's no path to a net zero carbon economy without the forest sector and forest products, full stop.
We'll talk about how and why Canadian forests have the ability to shift the climate crisis and the economy to build a better future.
There is no machine and no process known to man better than a tree that's sequestering carbon.
We'll explore innovations in forest management that drive a green economy and directly address the climate issue.
We have a significant amount of the world's forest land. With that privilege comes the responsibility of taking care of it.
So welcome in to this special series produced for Forestry for the Future. Okay, can I just start with a stat here?
Go for it.
All right, so the United Nations says forests cover 1/3 of the Earth's landmass, directly supporting the livelihoods of 1.6 billion people, and is home to more than half of the world's land-based species of animals, plants, insects, you name it.
Kind of makes you feel small.
A little bit, eh?
Also makes me realize two things. Number one, we really don't have any context of how much forest there actually is, particularly in our part of the world. Mm-hmm. And number two, I think it underlines how much we then take our forests for granted.
Yeah, the funny thing is once you start to grasp the sheer size of the forests, I mean the vast areas they cover, I'm beginning to think it's not all that unrealistic for us to say forests can save the world. I mean, in particular, Canadian forestry can play this critical role in fighting climate change.
So you cited that UN stat right off the top. The United Nations has already said our forests are critical in the collective effort to face down this climate crisis. So in this episode, we're going to talk about sustainability in forestry.
Yeah, we're going to meet Jenny Tallman. She's a chief forester for a major forestry company in Ontario. But first, we want to start our sustainability conversation introducing you to Peter Moonen.
I'm the National Sustainability Manager with the Canadian Wood Council, which is a technical support organization for the use of wood in construction in Canada. I live on the Sunshine Coast, Gibson's area, just west of Vancouver.
Peter's focus on sustainability at the Canadian Wood Council is focused specifically on the impact of using wood products versus other building material. It's good for the environment, the effects on the environment, and on the project itself. So what's the difference? What's the impact of using wood versus metal or concrete or plastic or any combination that provides the best eco outcome?
The first time I became aware of the embodied impact of materials was in 1992. And I met a fellow named Wink Sutton from New Zealand, and he would hold up a piece of aluminum, a piece of wood, and a piece of glass, all different sizes, and said, all of these take the same amount of energy to produce. And the piece of wood was about 1.5 feet long. It was a 2x4. And the piece of aluminum was a piece of aluminum extrusion for a window, and it was about 1/4 inch wide. And I realized at that point, this is now 30 years ago, we have to pay attention to what goes into making that material, not just what is the impact of that material in use. All of this came about from the science of life cycle analysis, which I think started about 50 years ago at one of the soft drink companies. I think it was Coke or Pepsi, that wanted to look at what goes into our product and how can we reduce the use of that, whether it's water, electricity, what have you. And that's how life cycle analysis started. But relatively speaking, it's a fairly new science.
Well, and I think to that point, we really haven't had the climate change discussion except with any intensity in the last 20 years. It's just become more urgent because we can see the effects more readily. We can see the intensity, whether it's of storms or of wildfire, whatever it might be. We're worrying about it because it has a direct effect on us.
I've been in the industry more than 30 years now, and we have a better understanding of what the impacts have been, and we have been able to translate that into what we anticipate the impacts will be if we do certain practices. When it comes to reforestation, we have an understanding from soil sciences what the forest has gone through in the past, and we can say, okay, this forest has a fire history or doesn't have a fire history. How do we emulate this when we log it? How do we emulate what nature has done so that if we leave it alone for another 500 years, it will come back to what nature had? So again, we're really trying to understand what the science of what nature does, but we don't really have a fully comprehensive understanding of how nature does it.
Does that make it more difficult then to sort of stand up and say, we have a role in the climate conversation and the climate change conversation?
I have no difficulty standing up and say, look, these are the attributes of wood. Here's how it can contribute to a reduction in embodied carbon, an improvement in insulation or thermal performance. But that doesn't mean that there's not concrete buildings or steel buildings that can also be high performance and high efficiency buildings. But what I'm trying to do is to help people understand the material itself. There's 4 basic construction material sectors: stone and masonry, steel, concrete, and wood or biomass materials, biogenic materials like bamboo. If you're an architect and you only understand steel and concrete, then that's going to limit what you might be able to achieve. But if you understand all 4 of those basic structural materials that are used globally, you're better equipped to deliver what the client wants or needs. Doesn't mean that you have to be a vegetarian and only use wood. It just means you have to understand, how does wood integrate into the construction and materials process?
I hadn't thought of a builder as being a vegetarian, but now since you put it that way,
well, in the context of
I hear you. No, I get it. Yeah. That's that kind of opens things up a little bit. Is there in your view and experience, is there a view that the Canadian timber versus timber from other parts of the world, because of our climate, et cetera, is more likely to be beneficial?
I think one of the biggest benefits that Canadian forests have is that it's owned by Canadians. It's not owned by companies. Yes, there are some private forest lands, and a couple percentage of the forest in BC is private forest land. There's private forest lands in the Maritimes. But for the most part, the forest of Canada, and I think it's something like 360 or 400 million hectares of forest, is owned by you and me, owned by Canadians. With that comes the expectation that those lands are going to be managed as well as possible. And again, it's not perfect because humans screw up. But I think the fact that our land is publicly held versus privately held is a big advantage, because it gives it means that we all have a stake in managing it well.
Does that put an emphasis or an onus or a responsibility on us in terms of, we who own the forests, and particularly in the Canadian sector, to take a leadership role when we talk about the effects of forestry on climate?
I think, again, I say this with a sense of humility, but also with pride, is that we have very well managed forests. We have lots and lots of forests, but we don't have them all. We have a responsibility to our owners, the Canadians who hold that land in trust now and for future generations. but we also we can demonstrate to other countries that, hey, you can have a viable, productive forest industry. So I think we can be a bit of an example. We should be aware that harvesting is an important part, because if you're not going to use wood and you still want to build, what are you going to use? Give me a product that is better than wood. Give me a product that is renewable, reusable, recyclable, organic, biodegradable, that produces oxygen as a waste product, that helps clean and store water, provides animal habitat, gives us a material that's strong, lightweight, beautiful, easy to use, diverse, and relatively inexpensive. And if you do something like that, do come up with that, I'd really like to know, because I think it'd be worth investing in.
Wow. Peter finishing with a real flurry.
Hey?
I know he's working with the Wood Council, but his rhetorical question really does encapsulate the narrative for this entire series. Wood is renewable, reusable, recyclable, organic, biodegradable, produces oxygen as a waste product, provides a building material that's easy to use and relatively inexpensive compared to almost all other materials. And it also captures carbon. And half the weight of a piece of wood is carbon. I don't know if you get a better rally cry for a forestry sector preparing to battle climate change.
Amen, sister. I mean, he kind of lit up, didn't he?
But you know what I really liked about his perspective is that he talks about the need for science. Forestry science that emulates nature. Because what I'm hearing him say is nature knows how to do this, so let's do it nature's way.
Yeah, really. I mean, doing it nature's way, and then we have this renewable resource that Peter Moonen is championing. But we really can't stop here, because there's a whole lot more to talk about when it comes to managing our forests. And you got to have a long view. 100, maybe 200 years is the horizon.
I'm Jennifer Tallman.
So we want you to meet Jennifer Tallman.
I'm the Chief Forester for Ontario with Interfor. I'm based out of Timmins. We have 5 sawmills in Ontario and 2 in Quebec. And we also manage forests in northeastern Ontario.
Jennifer's company has been granted 2 sustainable forestry licenses.
One for the pine land and the second for the Spanish forest. So that is all public Crown land. And we are given the license to manage the forest from start to finish. So we write the forest management plans. It's a 10-year forest management plan. We implement it, and that includes everything from how are you going to build roads, go do a harvest, have all of the protections in place, and renew the forest afterwards. And then we have the benefit of using the wood harvested off of those forests in our sawmills to produce lumber.
And yeah, I was going to ask you, so then you get the wood product itself as part of this license?
Yes, we get the conifers, so that's like spruce, pine, and fir, and we use those in our sawmills to produce lumber. Then there's other users on the forest that will use other species. So we'll have some of the hardwood will go to one company to make oriented strand board. Another one will go to make veneer products. We also have sawmills that use red and white pine.
And do the companies that use the species that you aren't milling, do they have to apply through you? How does that relationship work?
So the government will put in place a couple of things. So they may have a directive in which there's a supply agreement that they'll get a certain amount of wood off of our forests every year. And it can happen a couple of ways, that either from the areas that we're harvesting, we in turn sell that wood to them, or we may grant them what's called an overlapping license, that we can then give them specific areas to go harvest themselves and bring the wood to that mill.
Mm-hmm. So I'm fascinated by this sort of end-to-end approach to this. So walk me through that cycle.
So we write a 10-year forest management plan, and that's not done in isolation. So it's actually a 3-year process to write that plan. And there will be a team of the planning team that is made up of our foresters, some of our operations people, people from the Ministry of Natural Resources, and that can include like foresters, their biologists, whether it's like aquatic or wildlife biologists. We'll have representatives from First Nation communities in and around the area that have the option to sit on the planning team, as well as from the local citizens committees and various experts. And it starts out with, the first thing is figuring out kind of what's the objectives, and we will do modeling out 150 years to see how we can achieve those objectives. And those objectives really touch three things. It's the three aspects of sustainability. So environment, economics, and the communities. And so we can have a whole range of objectives that talks about what's the makeup of the species on the forest, and is that achieving what is naturally there and what it looked like prior to any kind of intervention. And we're actively making sure that we're staying within that range of natural variation. So if there was lots of white pine and there isn't now, then we have an objective to make sure that we increase white pine on the landscape. Or maybe there's lots of poplar, but that's not what it really looked like many, many years ago. Then we may have to reduce that. So it's making sure it's in the natural range of variation. If it was kind of similar to if it was a fire regime that came through, we're trying to manage that the same way. It also have wildlife objectives. So are there any species at risk on the forest? What do we have to do to manage for that? What do we have to do to manage for like water quality? There's other users on the forest, so we will have specific measures in place if we have any kind of operations around, say, a remote tourism outfitter that has its hunting and fishing camps, or the cottager areas. Also for the Indigenous communities, what are the values? How do our operations overlap what their values are and how they use the forest? And do we need to change anything like that? So once we've modeled it out and we're like, okay, this is taking into account everything we need to manage for, kind of the last part of the equation is how much can sustainably be harvested from that forest over that 10-year period of time. And then once we have that number and what the species makeup is, then we can start the really detailed planning of where are we going to have that harvest. And so how are you going to get there? Where are the roads going to go? What are the blocks? We call them blocks. That's like an area that will be harvested. How do those get assigned? We can only have a finite amount, like in total, but also by different species. So we'll have a certain number of blocks that are made up of spruce and pine and fir, and a certain number of blocks that might be made up of maple, and another certain number of blocks that are made up of poplar. So you just can't go, there's a recipe that we follow that comes out of this. We'll also plan for what's the silviculture, or how are we going to renew the forest? And that can be different depending on what the species that was there. As well as once we're finished an area, do we need to take those roads out? There may be a value, say for a remote tourism outfitter, okay, we're going to go in, we're going to harvest, we'll do the renewal, but we need to take the roads out afterwards in order to keep that business as a remote business, so that others can't come in behind him. On the other hand, we have parties that are like super happy to have some roads that can help them the public get to their new favorite fishing lake, or to be able to go hunting or camping on the weekend. So it's all very much a balance. These plans go out for public consultation numerous times, as well as we'll just sit down with people, in particularly the First Nations communities, to have the face-to-face conversations and figure out how we can make things work. So then at the end of 3 years, hopefully you have an approved plan in place and we can start the implementation. And at that point, we basically turn that over to our woodlands teams. And so we have 3 woodlands teams for these 2 forests that work with our harvest and our harvest contractors, our road building contractors, On the renewal side, we have tree planters, or we might be doing aerial seeding. So we'll work with them to implement the plan over that period of 10 years. So we'll go in, we'll look, ideally, we are able to build a road like at least a year ahead of time so that it has time to settle and tighten up. And then we will go in and harvest an area. Again, we put a plan, an annual plan forward to the ministry every year and say, this is where our plans are to go to build roads and to do harvest, and where we're planning to have our tree plant and do renewal. So then the public gets advised a year in advance as to what's going to be happening on the ground. And there could be further conversations at that point, particularly with the First Nations communities. There may be new values that have changed or we weren't aware of. So we'll do like a thorough review with them, and we'll go out and look at areas on the ground as well. So if there's something, we may decide we're not going to harvest an entire block because of a value that our operations overlap. And so we may carve off a portion and say, okay, we'll stay out of there, but the rest of this is okay. We'll do a lot of that planning with them directly on the ground where we can see what's going on.
So when you talk about all of these facets, you've got to have all those balls in the air at once, right? I mean, to be able to consider how we're going to harvest, how we're going to regenerate, how we're going to plan out further in terms of what's the next block, 3 or 4 years from now.
Yes. Yeah, there's a lot going on. So, and there's a whole team of people to do that. So, we use geographic information systems that lay out the maps, allow us to look at stuff on screen. We have aerial photography, we use satellite photography, and we have people just on the ground that go down, go look at it. There's nothing beats actually going into a particular area that you're going to have operations to go see it firsthand before anything happens.
Walk me through that kind of, how the environment sort of dictates that bigger plan.
Sure. Yeah. So I would say we're learning that as we go and taking that into account as we go. There's not here's the recipe for when your forest is going to change, according to the climate. However, there's a lot of things that we're doing now that will help that along or help mitigate it. So we're part of, with our trees that we grow, we're part of a seed association, and it's all, various forest managers around Ontario. So that is something that they have been talking about for a number of years and looking at the modeling. And we work with Canadian Forest Service or the Ministry of Natural Resources and Forestry, their science people, as they've modeled out some of these things and they're the ones that have more expertise on it. But how do we apply it on our forest? So there's already been a change in policy with the Ontario government about where we can source seed from. And so the seed that we use to grow trees to plant on our forest, it has to come from within a geographic area that it's going to grow. However, it's been modified. That policy has been modified in the last couple of years that we can pull from areas further south now, anticipating that we're going to need to be planting trees that are adapted today to further south from us, but with the temperature warming, they'll be migrating further north into our forests. So we've had that change in policy. We're doing some trials with some tree seedlings from a forest further south to plant those and see how that works. And then just some of the other stuff is we participate in research. So you have a number of forest managers that will participate in research to model it out, but also try some of the different species on the ground and see how it's going to evolve. One of the biggest things that we're looking at is, I think it's changed from 20, 30 years ago, where you harvested an area and you wanted it to all come back to one species. It's very much about having a mix of species on the ground now so that your forest is more resilient. So with climate change, if you have a certain pest that's coming along, if you have a mix of species, you're not going to have your whole area wiped out. You've got where something may attack the conifer, you've got hardwood there, or a different, it could be just if it attacks the spruce, it may not attack the jack pine. So having that mix of species is is also one of the ways to manage for that.
The only other question I just want to get to is just your assessment. I know we've talked a lot about climate change and the mitigation factors, et cetera. And we get the quote from the UN that we can't have a distinct climate change plan or strategy without the forestry industry. Do we get to net zero without the forestry sector participating?
No, for sure. You have all, I mean, just looking at the Canadian context and how much of our country is covered by forest and the ability of those forests to like absorb carbon, produce oxygen. I don't know how you get to it without the active involvement of the forest sector. Forests are such a part of the solution. Whether it's in the products, like if you take a lumber product, you've just stored carbon for many years, however long that piece of furniture is going to hang around, or the wood that is part of your house it has the ability to store carbon for that long. And then how you're managing the forest when you're planting new trees, they have they have almost all of their cycle there that they're going to be absorbing carbon and emitting oxygen. I don't see how you do it without the contribution of forests.
Well, you heard her. No net zero without the forestry sector. Forests are part of the climate change solution. And Jenny Tallman sets us up nicely to explore the forest life cycle and bust the myth that once that tree is gone, it's gone forever.
All right, so I'm beginning to believe. I believe. Canadian forests can indeed save this planet. For Aaron and our producer, Becky Coles, thanks for listening. This podcast series is produced for Forestry for the Future. And for more information, I'd encourage you to visit the website forestryforthefuture.ca. And you may want to get involved in supporting a sector that's committed to growing a greener economy and driving our country towards a net zero carbon future for you and your kids. I'm Dave Trafford, and Canadian Forestry Can Save the World is produced by Story Studio Network.
This is SSN.